There's several parts to this, so I'll go in different sections. But first, just so I think we're on the same page. When we're talking about Dreamers, we're talking about DACA, I've heard many times the statement that these kids have done nothing wrong, and in fact, they were brought here by their parents. They had no say in the matter, and why are we punishing them? Would that be on track?
These children have been brought to this country, some of them through no fault of their own. But the truth is, and the fact of the matter in this bill, is that New York State has already invested in their education. From K to 12th grade, New York State pays for public education for all children, regardless of their immigration status.
And by New York State, you mean the taxpayers?
Correct.
Correct. But my point being that these kids haven't done anything wrong. They haven't broken the law. So if we're not passing the DREAM Act, if DACA is not straightened out, I've heard it said that we're punishing these kids for the crimes committed by their parents, and that's wrong. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Okay. Now, let's start with the DREAM Fund. Who makes up the commission, the DREAM Fund Commission? Who makes that up? Who appoints them?
Sure. So there are 12 members to be appointed to the commission. 4 members are appointed by the governor. 3 are appointed by the temporary president of the Senate. 3 members are appointed by the Speaker of the Assembly. 1 member is appointed by the minority leader of the Senate, and 1 member by the minority leader of the Assembly.
So not only is this commission sanctioned by the state, it's actually put together by state elected officials.
Correct.
Okay, and is part of the duty of the commission deciding the eligibility and who receives these scholarships?
Yes.
Okay, and when we talk about eligibility, as part of the eligibility, it says the scholarships would go to students who are children of immigrants, and it goes a little further to say who have at least one parent or guardian who immigrated to the United States. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Okay, so let's talk about who would not be eligible under the DREAM Fund. So if one parent or guardian must be an immigrant or immigrated here, so we have a 3rd-generation family from Ronkonkoma, New York. Their parents grew up in Ronkonkoma, their grandparents who grew up on Long Island in Ronkonkoma. They're 3rd-generation kids. They want to go to college. Would they be eligible for funds under the DREAM Fund?
No.
No, because they are not, their parents were not immigrant or immigrated here.
Correct.
Okay. The point I'm trying to make is, although we are putting together this DREAM Fund is from private funds, aren't we sanctioning discrimination? I mean, what I described when I first started talking was, when we were talking about the Dreamers, we were talking about kids who did nothing wrong. Why are they being punished? And yet, we're saying to the legal 3rd-generation children, well, because your parents had the audacity to be born here, you will not be qualified to get any funding through the DREAM Fund. How is that not discriminating against them for something that they haven't done wrong?
This bill opens up the eligibility for TAP in-state tuition. Those students have access to TAP, have access to in-state tuition. They would also have access to the Excelsior Scholarship.
That's through TAP. We're talking about 2 different things, though, because the DREAM Fund is not the same as the DREAM Act.
These funds, the DREAM Fund and the DREAM Act don't compete, right? The DREAM Act is a needs-based award.
Right.
It's given to whoever qualifies, whoever meets the requirement. The DREAM Fund is a scholarship.
Exactly. And that's why I started with the DREAM Fund, because I did not want to mix it up with the DREAM Act. We'll get to the DREAM Act. But the DREAM Fund by itself is a scholarship program. The state is obviously sanctioning because the state has put together the commission. And yet this commission can say no to legal tax-paying residents and say, no, you do not get any funding through this. It'll only go to the children of those who've come here illegally.
Like any other scholarship, there's requirements. If the person meets the requirements, they would get the scholarship.
But is the requirement where you're born? Isn't that out of control? Isn't that what we said in the very beginning? So we're going to punish these kids who are here legally.
The requirement is that a parent or guardian be an immigrant.
Okay, so we'll go to the DREAM Act.
1 minute, please. Mr. Morelli, why do you rise?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I apologize for the interruption. But I would like to ask members of the Election Law Committee to join Mr. Levine in the Speaker's conference room. My apologies to the two members.
Certainly. Election Law Committee, Mr. Levine is on his way. You will follow him. Thank you. Proceed, sir. Sorry.
Thank you, sir. So moving now to the DREAM Act. Now, as you said, the DREAM Act will be allocated through the TAP program, correct?
Correct.
Which means those who are in the DREAM Act will also now be eligible for the Excelsior Scholarship Program, which also goes through the TAP program, correct?
Correct.
And how much are we allocating of taxpayer funds for TAP?
$27 million is the estimate.
That's for DREAM Act, right? But then there's more for TAP altogether, correct?
The total is $27 million.
Okay. And the TAP fund, as we said, is funded through taxpayer dollars, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Are there, as my colleague earlier brought up the income requirements, what are or I'll bring them up. The income requirements right now for the Excelsior Scholarship Program, what we did was we moved it up this year to 110,000 household income. Next year it'll go to 125, correct?
Correct.
And that's where it taps out.
Yes.
No pun intended. But 125 is the top. How are we verifying the income, as my colleague brought up, if the parents are here illegally and are not, they don't have Social Security numbers, so they are not paying income tax, how are we checking and verifying the income eligibility of these students?
There's ways to confirm and verify income eligibility. For example, they could use receipts, pay stubs, and any other way of proving what your income is.
So if they don't prove their income, they don't get it?
Correct.
So no dreamer will get the Excelsior Scholarship or TAP funds if their parents are not able to verify their income and meet the requirements.
If they cannot meet the requirements, they will not be eligible.
So as far as the Excelsior Scholarship Program and through TAP, one of the requirements also through the Excelsior Scholarship is that all funds go towards tuition, correct?
Correct.
So the books, lodging, meals, all the ancillary, that is not included in the Excelsior Scholarship Program.
Correct.
Okay, but yet, in the DREAM Fund and in this bill, Section 11, paragraph D, line 49, there is also funds available through the DREAM Fund for any necessary supplemental financial assistance, which may include the cost of books and necessary maintenance for such enrolled students. Now, aren't we doing kind of an end run around the requirements of the Excelsior Scholarship Program by doing this?
Well, the fund would allow, as you know, when a student goes to school in this state, there's other needs that they have to meet,
Sure.
right? The scholarship would allow for them to pay for those extra needs.
But under the Excelsior Scholarship requirements and under TAP, it is required that all funds, meaning whether it's a Bell Grant or anything, grants, scholarship funds, all of it has to go towards tuition first and cannot go towards books, meals, room and board, and all of this. And yet, that's exactly what we're doing in this
The
bill.
section that you cited is for the opportunity programs, and the opportunity programs do allow for students to access other services, so transportation and other cost of books and other costs that come with higher education.
And those students you're talking about are the students that would qualify through the DREAM Fund, which are not the legal tax-paying students, correct?
Correct, but the DREAM Fund would allow for them to access, so they could use the Excelsior Scholarship if they qualify, right? And they could apply for the DREAM Act Fund Scholarship.
Right.
If they qualify and they get that money could be used theoretically to supplement any other cost related to higher education.
I understand what you're saying, and that is a direct end run around the Excelsior Scholarship Program, which absolutely requires any funds, including scholarships, be put towards tuition. So for a legal tax-paying student, they get a scholarship. That scholarship money has to go towards tuition, period. They're not allowed to do this, but now that same legal tax-paying student who uses their scholarship pays for the tuition. They're not eligible under the DREAM Fund to get this supplemental scholarship to pay for their room and board and meals and transportation
So
and
there's
such.
two separate things here. The opportunity programs, right? Anyone who qualifies for the opportunity programs could use that money for whatever that program allows them to. For example, HEOP and EOP allow for students to use that money that they're given for any other costs. The Dream Fund is a separate source of support for these students.
But it's in the bill that the Dream Fund would be giving them the money for that, whereas the legal tax-paying student is not eligible for the Dream Fund. We already stated that.
As long as Excelsior is used as last dollar, that would be fine under this bill.
But again, in this bill and the wording of this bill, it is giving this money, this opportunity, this scholarship is through the Dream Fund, which is not available to the third generation legal tax-paying student. Therefore, they're being shortchanged, and this is somewhat of an end run around the Excelsior Scholarships program. So literally, a dreamer could go through the Excelsior Scholarship program, get all of their tuition paid for free, through the taxpayers, then turn around and get, through this scholarship that is not available to the legal tax-paying resident, all of their books and their room and board and their meals. So they are literally getting free college, while a legal third-generation tax-paying student whose parents are struggling to pay the bills is not eligible for all of that.
All who are eligible would be able to apply for the fund and for TAP and for the opportunity programs. These funds are not in competition with one another. They're loan-standing funds, and as long as you meet the requirements, you would have access to these funds.
Thank you, Mrs. De La Rosa.
Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, on the bill?
On the bill, Mr. Murray.
Understand, when I started the statement and the questions, I had said that the Dreamers did not do anything. They didn't break the law. They didn't have a say. You're right, and we want to provide opportunity. That's not a question. We do. They have been here. But earlier on, the sponsor said a quote about the Dreamers that said, they made New York their home, contributed to the economy of New York State, and know no other home. That also describes that third-generation family from Ronkonkoma. They contribute to the economy. They know no other home. Their parents did nothing wrong. They were born here, and yet they cannot qualify for some of these benefits. You know, when we hear from the legal, and I'm calling them the forgotten legal middle class, because we keep hearing stories. DACA, the governor puts out a press release, they'll get health care through Medicaid regardless of what Washington does. And people say, well, what about us? Docs, just this week, Department of Corrections says free tablets through a program they negotiated with one of their vendors. Free tablets to the prisoners. And again, the legal tax-paying residents are saying, what about us? We're struggling to pay for this stuff. The DREAM Act, now free college. Again, what about us? Why are we struggling and we can't get that help? You know, I'm getting emails, phone calls, angry emails and phone calls saying, what about us? The forgotten legal middle class. Well, I'm not going to forget about them. I'm not going to forget about you. That's why I'll be voting no to this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Understand, when I started the statement and the questions, I had said that the Dreamers did not do anything. They didn't break the law. They didn't have a say. You're right, and we want to provide opportunity. That's not a question. We do. They have been here. But earlier on, the sponsor said a quote about the Dreamers that said, they made New York their home, contributed to the economy of New York State, and know no other home. That also describes that third-generation family from Ronkonkoma. They contribute to the economy. They know no other home. Their parents did nothing wrong. They were born here, and yet they cannot qualify for some of these benefits. You know, when we hear from the legal, and I'm calling them the forgotten legal middle class, because we keep hearing stories. DACA, the governor puts out a press release, they'll get health care through Medicaid regardless of what Washington does. And people say, well, what about us? Docs, just this week, Department of Corrections says free tablets through a program they negotiated with one of their vendors. Free tablets to the prisoners. And again, the legal tax-paying residents are saying, what about us? We're struggling to pay for this stuff. The DREAM Act, now free college. Again, what about us? Why are we struggling and we can't get that help? You know, I'm getting emails, phone calls, angry emails and phone calls saying, what about us? The forgotten legal middle class. Well, I'm not going to forget about them. I'm not going to forget about you. That's why I'll be voting no to this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.